discuss the aggregate demand, and in this video, we'll look at the aggregate supply and macro equilibrium. So learning aggregate demand, you should understand that you can simply using the idea of the demand curve to understand aggregate demand. So there are total two different kind of things. And especially when we look at the aggregate demand, you have to pay attention on why our aggregate demand curves go downward. It is because of three different effects. The real balance effect, foreign trade effect, and interest rate effect. Very similarly, when you are learning the aggregate supply, you shouldn't simply using the idea of the supply curve to understand aggregate supply. Again, they are totally different concept. So first of all, what is aggregate supply? So the aggregate supply is the total quantity of the output producers are willing and able to supply. So this usually measured by the real GDP at alternative price level, and usually it's measured by the CPI in a given time or period, ceteris paribus. So very similar as our aggregate demand, the aggregate supply is looking at the relationship between real GDP and the price level. So instead, in the supply curve, we're looking at the relationship between a price for a product and the quantity supplied of that product. So the aggregated supply is obviously considered a collective behavior of all suppliers and sellers in the marketplace, and it comprises all goods and services. It's not just talk about one single product. It's consider everything sold on the market. So for the aggregate supply curve, it's a downward curve, and it's indicating the suppliers will producing more if the price is higher. So if the price level is higher, and vice versa. So why this will be an upward curve, just like what I'm showing you here. So this is aggregate supply curve. Without labeling the vertical and the horizontal axis, you might not be able to see whether this is an aggregate supply or supply curve. After we label the vertical and horizontal axis, so the vertical axis is the price level, and the horizontal axis is real output, and you should know this actually is aggregate supply curve. So why the aggregate supply curve is upwards? So actually, we can explain it through two different effects. So one is called the profit effect, another is called the cost effect. So in order to understand the profit effect, let's think about the plastics. So I know in this area, Pennsylvania area, we have so many plastic industry. And so if you know somebody who work for the plastic industry, you should ask them, what is the feedstock for the plastics? So they will talk about, okay, that's HDPE, and usually it's coming from the crude oil. So you're right. So what happens is usually they bind a contract, HDPE future contract. So in that case, they actually lock their cost. So why I mention this scenario? Because this scenario will help you to understand the profit effect. So the profit effect is when the cost is not changed, when the price level change in the short term. So such as I mentioned about the plastic. So when the price level goes up, which means the plastics price goes up. However, they have a future contract with their feedstock, so the feedstock's price will not rise instantly as price level goes up. So what does that mean? So if the cost hold as constant, but the price of the product goes up, so that means every product they sell, the profit revenue will goes up. So which means they actually can produce more given their budgets, right? So that's what happens when the price level goes up, the profit margin goes up, then the producer are able to produce more, so that's why the supply goes up. So this is called the profit effect, when the cost is not respond to the price level increase in a short period of time. So not all the goods costs will hold as constant. So how about other goods? So if the price level goes up, their cost also goes up as well, right? Like when we talk about producing ice cream. So when the price level goes up, the milk price goes up too. So which the feed starts producing the ice cream. So the cost to produce the ice cream goes up. So why in that scenario, the producer tend to produce more? So think about if the cost goes up And also, at the same time, the product they're made is price goes up. So they are all floating up. So the best strategy for the producer is try to produce more in order to cover the increased cost, right? So that's the cost effect. So they try to produce more to cover the increased cost because the price level goes up. So both effect will causing the upward aggregate supply. So to summarize what I just mentioned, so for the profit effect is for the condition when the no change happening in the cost of the operating the business. So the rising the price will improve the profits. So that drive the supplier to produce more. For the cost effect, so the cost increase make producing the product more expensive, and producer will be willing to supply more only if the price also rise to cover those added costs. So both effect will cause the upward aggregate supply. So at this point, you have to understand the downward aggregate demand and upward aggregate supply have different reason to showing that pattern and different from the individual supply and demand curve. So you have to understand totally we learned 5 different effects. So you need to know how to explain using those effects to explain the downward aggregate demand curve and upward aggregate supply curve. So next we will look at the macro equilibrium. So for the macro equilibrium, it's very similar as our equilibrium for the individual supply and the demand curve. So when we look at these two curves, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, so they both have the same vertical axis and a horizontal axis. In order to find equilibrium, we just need to put them together. So once we put them together, we will find the intersection point here, E. So that E is indicating the macro equilibrium point. So corresponding to this intersection, we can find the horizontal value, the vertical value, and the horizontal value. So the horizontal value here will give you the equilibrium price level, and the vertical value here will give us the horizontal value here will give us the equilibrium point for the real GDP output, real GDP. So the macro equilibrium is the combination of the price level and output that is compatible with both aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So very similar as the equilibrium in the micro in the individual supply and the demand, equilibrium is unique. So which means we cannot have more than one equilibrium in one chart. So we only have one intersection. So it is only price level output combination that is mutually compatible with aggregate demand and aggregate supply, or in other words, with the intentions of the buyer and the sellers. So that is where we can find our macro equilibrium. So in our next video, as we discuss why we need a government intervention, because sometimes we cannot achieve equilibrium point or this equilibrium point is broke. So that's what we look at is called the macro failure.